Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're taking a look inside you.
Literally.
Yeah, literally into a system you're using right now, but probably never think about your autonomic nervous system.
Right. Fascinating stuff.
It is, and we're diving deep into a medical text chapter all about it. And I gotta say, one of the things that drew me in right away
Oh, yeah.
was this crazy case study about a woman with blepharospasm.
Oh, wow.
Basically, her eyelids were clamping shut constantly.
Which she couldn't open her eyes.
Yeah, she could only see for a few seconds at a time. Imagine that.
Oh, that would be debilitating.
Totally. But here's the wild part. Doctors injected her eyelids with botulinum toxin.
Botox.
Yep, Botox, and it restored her vision.
Wow. That's incredible. I mean, it makes sense when you think about how Botox works, but still.
It is mind-blowing, right? And it all comes down to this incredible complexity of our nervous system. So
Exactly.
to kind of break this down, let's start with Nervous System 101. Our source talks about two main parts, the central nervous system, so your brain and spinal cord. And then everything else branching out from there is the peripheral nervous system.
And within that peripheral nervous system, we have two functional subdivisions.
Okay.
So we have the somatic nervous system, which is all about those voluntary movements. So you decide to reach for your coffee. That's your somatic nervous system in action.
Okay, got it.
And then we have the autonomic nervous system, and this one's handling all the involuntary stuff, keeping you alive even when you're not consciously thinking about it.
So like breathing, heart rate, digestion, that's all autonomic?
Exactly. It's always working in the background, keeping those essential functions going.
And we don't even have to think about it. It's amazing.
And what's really fascinating is there's growing research suggesting that the autonomic nervous system might be involved in even more than we originally thought her. Things like immune response and even some brain functions.
Really? So beyond just basic survival stuff?
Yeah, there are some links to things like seizures and even the development of cancer. It's pretty mind-blowing.
Wow, so it's way more influential than we might realize.
Absolutely.
So to do all of this, both the somatic and autonomic systems rely on sensory input, right?
Exactly. They need information about what's going on both inside and outside the body.
So like a constant feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a super highway of information constantly flowing back and forth, allowing the brain to adjust and maintain balance.
Okay, that makes sense. And it all happens through these chemical messengers, right? The neurotransmitters.
Right, just like the endocrine system. The nervous system uses these chemical messengers to transmit information between cells.
Yeah, like dopamine, serotonin, those are the famous ones, right?
Those are definitely important, but there are many more, and they're all released at these specialized junctions between nerve cells called synapses.
Synapses.
Yeah, and they bind to specific receptors on the receiving cell. And that triggers a whole cascade of events.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. And this whole process is a potential target for drugs. We can use this knowledge to modify various bodily functions.
That's where things get really interesting from a medical standpoint, right?
Oh, absolutely. If we can understand how these neurotransmitters work, we can potentially develop drugs to treat a whole range of conditions.
It's amazing, but I imagine it's a very delicate system to manipulate.
Oh, it is. Messing with one part can definitely have unintended consequences elsewhere.
It's all connected, right? So let's focus in on the autonomic nervous system. Now, I know it's divided into two branches, the sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Right. Think of them as two sides of a coin, often working in opposition to maintain that balance we talked about.
Okay.
So the sympathetic nervous system, that's your fight or flight response. It's what kicks in when you're facing a threat.
So like if you're about to give a big presentation and your heart's racing, palms are sweaty.
Exactly. That's your sympathetic nervous system prepping you for action, either fight or run.
Makes sense. And the parasympathetic is the opposite then?
Yes, the parasympathetic is all about rest and digest.
Yeah.
Promoting relaxation, slowing things down, conserving energy.
So after that big presentation, when you're finally chilling out with a nice meal, that's the parasympathetic taking over.
Precisely. It's all about bringing you back to a calm and balanced state.
Wow. So functionally, it seems pretty straightforward. What about anatomically? Are there distinct differences between the two branches?
Absolutely. So sympathetic nerves, they originate mostly from the thoracic and lumbar regions of your spinal cord,
Okay.
while parasympathetic nerves come from the brainstem and the sacral area of your spinal cord.
Wait, sacral, isn't that the lower back? But don't the pelvic organs, like the bladder, fall under parasympathetic control?
That's what's traditionally been taught, and it makes sense intuitively.
Right.
But recent research suggests that those sacral nerves controlling the pelvic organs might actually be part of the sympathetic system.
Really?
Yeah, it's a bit of a shakeup in our understanding of the autonomic nervous system.
Wow. So what we thought was a clear division is turning out to be more complex.
Exactly. Science is always evolving. There's always something new to discover.
Now, our source also mentions this thing called the enteric nervous system. It's like a mini brain in our gut.
Right, over 150 million neurons in the walls of your digestive system.
That's incredible.
It's often considered a third division of the autonomic nervous system because it has a remarkable degree of autonomy.
So it can operate independently.
To a certain extent, yes. It receives input from both sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, but it can also function on its own to control things like gut motility and secretion.
Wow. So even if the connection to the brain was severed, our gut could still keep things moving.
To a certain extent, yes. It's pretty amazing.
Now let's talk about the chemical messengers themselves. The main players in the autonomic nervous system seem to be acetylcholine and norepinephrine.
Right, those are the big ones. The cholinergic nerve releases acetylcholine, and you find them in all the preganglionic autonomic fibers, meaning both branches use acetylcholine at that first synapse point.
Oh, interesting.
They're also found in most of the parasympathetic postganglionic fibers.
Okay, so both branches use acetylcholine at the first synapse, but then they diverge at the second synapse.
Exactly. Most sympathetic postganglionic fibers are noradrenergic, meaning they release norepinephrine.
Makes sense.
But of course, there are exceptions. The sympathetic fibers controlling your sweat glands, for example, those are actually cholinergic.
Oh, really? So it's not as simple as sympathetic equals norepinephrine and parasympathetic equals acetylcholine.
Nope, there's some overlap and exceptions to the rule, which makes it even more fascinating.
It always does. And to make things even more interesting, both cholinergic and adrenergic nerves can release additional co-transmitters along with their primary neurotransmitter.
Right, these co-transmitters can fine-tune the signal, adding another layer of complexity to the communication.
Wow, it's not just on or off. It's like a whole orchestra of chemical signals happening at every synapse.
Exactly, a beautifully orchestrated system.
So we've got this basic framework now of the autonomic nervous system, two branches, different neurotransmitters, all working together to keep our bodies in balance.
It's a remarkable system, isn't it?
It really is, and we've only just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore.
I'm ready. Let's dive in. Welcome back to our deep dive into the autonomic nervous system.
Picking up right where we left off.
Yeah, we were talking about acetylcholine, one of those key neurotransmitters.
Right, and we covered how it's synthesized, how it's stored, even how botulinum toxin can block its release.
Right, bringing us back to that blepharospasm case.
Exactly. But the story of acetylcholine isn't over, yet we still need to talk about how its action is stopped and those different types of receptors it acts on.
Oh, right, because it can't just keep signaling forever. There has to be a way to turn it off.
Exactly, and that's where acetylcholinesterase comes in. It's an enzyme often shortened to ACD.
Okay.
And it acts like a cleanup crew, rapidly breaking down acetylcholine into choline and acetate.
So it just dismantles it.
Pretty much. And those breakdown products, they don't have any significant transmitter effects.
Got it. So it's a very efficient system, making sure that signal is turned off quickly.
Yeah, that rapid breakdown is essential for precise control of nerve impulses. If acetylcholine lingered in the synapse, it could lead to all sorts of problems like muscle spasms or even worse.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we've got the off switch. Now, what about those receptors you mentioned that acetylcholine can act on different types?
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Of course not. It's biology. It's never that simple.
Exactly. So we have two main categories of cholinergic receptors, muscarinic and nicotinic.
Muscarinic, nicotinic, those names sound familiar.
They're named after compounds that were originally used to distinguish them, muscarine and nicotine.
Ah, so muscarinic receptors are activated by muscarine, nicotinic by nicotine.
Yep, like a lock and key.
So where do we find these receptors?
Well, muscarinic receptors are found on various effector cells throughout the body, things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle glands.
Okay.
And they're responsible for a whole range of those parasympathetic effects.
Yeah.
Think about what happens when your parasympathetic nervous system is dominant. Your heart rate slows down, digestion gets stimulated. Your pupils constrict, all thanks to muscarinic receptors.
So it's all about that rest and digest response.
Exactly.
Okay, what about nicotinic receptors? Where are they hanging out?
Nicotinic receptors are mainly found on those postganglionic neurons in both sympathetic and parasympathetic ganglia,
Okay.
and also at the neuromuscular junction. That's where nerves connect to skeletal muscles.
So they're involved in both branches of the autonomic nervous system and in our voluntary movements.
They play a critical role in transmitting signals that cause muscle contraction, whether it's your heart beating or your arm moving.
Wow, they're multitaskers.
And it gets even more fascinating when you consider that there are subtypes within these receptor categories.
Subtypes.
Yeah, so you have different flavors of muscarinic and nicotinic receptors, each with its own unique distribution and function.
So it's not just muscarinic, it's like muscarinic 1, muscarinic 2, and so on.
Exactly. You have M1 through M5 for muscarinic receptors, for example.
Okay.
And this diversity is a gold mine for drug development because it allows for more targeted therapies.
So you can design drugs that specifically hit certain subtypes.
Exactly. Minimizing those unwanted side effects.
It's like using a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer.
Precisely. And the same principle applies to adrenergic receptors. Those are the ones that respond to norepinephrine and epinephrine.
Right. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about norepinephrine, the other big player in the autonomic nervous system.
Right. The primary neurotransmitter released by most sympathetic postganglionic fibers.
And just like acetylcholine, it goes through those same key steps: synthesis, storage, release, termination of action, and then receptor effects.
Each step is a potential point of regulation and a possible target for drugs.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. How is norepinephrine made?
It's actually synthesized from an amino acid called tyrosine.
Okay.
And tyrosine is converted into L-dopa and then into dopamine.
Wait, dopamine?
Yes, dopamine is actually a precursor to norepinephrine.
I never knew that. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in its own right, but in noradrenergic neurons, it gets converted into norepinephrine.
Exactly, and because of this relationship, drugs that affect dopamine synthesis can also influence norepinephrine levels.
Fascinating. So it's like a cascade, one molecule transforming into another.
Precisely. And like any biochemical pathway, this synthesis process can be interfered with by drugs.
You're going to say there's a drug for that.
Of course, there's a drug for that. One example is metaricine. It inhibits the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase, the first step in the pathway. So blocking this enzyme reduces the production of dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine.
Wow. So it's a way to dampen the whole sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah, pretty powerful stuff.
Okay, so we've made norepinephrine now. How do we store it?
Just like acetylcholine, it's stored in vesicles, those tiny containers we talked about.
Okay.
And a protein called the vesicular monoamine transporter, or VMAT, is responsible for packing it in.
And I bet there are drugs that can block that too.
You bet. There are rezapine and tetrabenazine are two examples. They inhibit VMAT, and that leads to depletion of norepinephrine stores.
So another way to modulate sympathetic activity.
Exactly.
Okay, so what triggers the release of norepinephrine into the synapse?
Same signal that triggers acetylcholine, release an action potential, that electrical signal reaching the nerve terminal. And that triggers the influx of calcium ions.
Calcium again.
Calcium's a key player in so many cellular processes. And in this case, it's the signal that tells those vesicles to fuse with the membrane and release their contents, including norepinephrine.
So it's like a perfectly timed release.
Exactly.
And of course, there are drugs that can interfere with this too.
There are drugs like guanethidine and beryllium that can block norepinephrine release.
Yeah.
But they're not commonly used these days.
Okay, so once norepinephrine is out there, how do we turn it off?
Unlike acetylcholine, which is broken down by an enzyme, norepinephrine is primarily removed from the synapse through reuptake.
Reuptake, so it's recycled.
Exactly. It's taken back up into the nerve terminal by a protein called a norepinephrine transporter, or NET.
NET, like a little vacuum cleaner.
Exactly. Sucking norepinephrine back in where it can be repackaged or broken down.
This NET protein sounds important. Are there any drugs that target it?
Oh, you know there are.
Let me guess, cocaine.
You got it. Cocaine blocks NET, preventing that reuptake of norepinephrine. Yeah. And that leads to a buildup of norepinephrine in the synapse, prolonging its effects and contributing to cocaine stimulant properties.
Wow, so it's like hijacking the brain's reward system.
In a way, yes.
Okay, so we've covered the whole journey of norepinephrine. Now, what about those receptors that acts on those adrenergic receptors?
Right. And just like cholinergic receptors, adrenergic receptors also have subtypes.
Of course they do.
The two main categories are alpha and beta receptors.
Okay, and I'm assuming each subtype has its own unique function and distribution.
Absolutely. You got alpha receptors are further divided into alpha 1 and alpha 2 subtypes.
Okay.
Alpha 1 receptors are mainly found on smooth muscle, and they're responsible for contractions, things like vasoconstriction, which narrows blood vessels and increases blood pressure.
So when you need to boost blood pressure quickly, like in a fight or flight situation.
Exactly. Alpha 1 receptors are there to do the job.
And alpha 2 receptors.
Those are a bit different. They're often located on presynaptic nerve terminals and act as autoreceptors.
Autoreceptor.
Meaning they regulate the release of norepinephrine itself.
So they're like a feedback mechanism.
Exactly. When norepinephrine is released, it can bind to these alpha 2 receptors, and that binding actually inhibits further release of norepinephrine.
Wow, so it's like a self-regulating system.
Precisely a way to prevent excessive stimulation.
Pretty clever. What about beta receptors?
We've got beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 subtypes.
Okay, hit me with it.
Beta 1 receptors are primarily found in the heart, and they increase heart rate and contractility.
So when norepinephrine binds to them, your heart beats faster and stronger.
Exactly. That's what you need when you're running from that saber-toothed tiger.
Makes sense. What about beta 2?
Beta 2 receptors are mainly found in smooth muscle, particularly in the bronchioles of your lungs.
Okay.
And when norepinephrine binds to them, it causes relaxation, leading to bronchodilation or widening of the airways.
Ah, so that's why beta 2 agonists are used in inhalers for asthma.
Exactly. They mimic the effects of norepinephrine, helping to open up those airways.
That makes so much sense now. And beta 3?
Beta 3 receptors are a bit more mysterious. They're primarily found in adipose tissue or body fat, and may play a role in regulating metabolism and energy expenditure.
Interesting. So all 3 subtypes of beta receptors are involved in different aspects of that fight or flight response?
Exactly. Boosting cardiovascular function, opening up the airways, mobilizing energy stores. It's all about preparing your body to deal with the perceived threat.
It's incredible how this all works together so seamlessly.
It really is a testament to the power and efficiency of our bodies.
We've covered so much ground: acetylcholine, norepinephrine, all these different receptors.
But we haven't even touched on those non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic neurons yet.
Oh, right, those enigmatic neurons that operate outside the traditional acetylcholine and norepinephrine pathways.
They're a bit of a mystery, but we're starting to unravel their secrets.
I'm intrigued. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the autonomic nervous system. It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've gone deep into those neurotransmitters. Those receptors even touched upon the enteric nervous system.
Right now, it's time to zoom out and see the bigger picture, how this whole intricate system is organized and regulated.
Exactly. How does it all work together to keep our bodies in balance?
It's like looking at the control panel for the whole operation.
I like that analogy, and one of the key principles at play here is negative feedback.
Negative feedback. That takes me back to biology class.
Right. It's a fundamental concept in physiology and crucial for understanding how the autonomic nervous system maintains stability.
Okay, so remind me how it works again.
Well, think of a thermostat. If the temperature gets too high, it kicks in to cool things down. If it gets too low, it turns on the heat.
Right, so it's about maintaining a stable set point.
Exactly. A change triggers a response that counteracts that change.
And the autonomic nervous system uses this principle all the time for things like heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature.
Absolutely. Our source uses blood pressure regulation as a great example.
Yeah.
Imagine you stand up suddenly after lying down.
Oh yeah, I've definitely experienced that head rush.
Right. Gravity pulls blood away from your head, causing a drop in blood pressure.
Okay.
And specialized sensors, called baroreceptors, they detect this drop.
Where are these baroreceptors?
They're located in your carotid arteries and aorta,
Okay.
and they send signals to the brainstem, which is like the command center for the autonomic nervous system.
So it's like an alarm system.
Exactly. It's saying, hey, blood pressure's dropping. We need to do something.
And then what happens?
The brainstem increases sympathetic outflow to your heart and blood vessels,
Okay.
causing your heart to beat faster and stronger, and your blood vessels to constrict to raise that blood pressure back up.
So a coordinated response to counteract the drop?
Exactly. And the parasympathetic system plays a role too.
Oh, right. How so?
While sympathetic outflow is increasing, parasympathetic outflow to the heart is reduced.
Okay.
This further contributes to the increase in heart rate, helping to get that blood pressure back up quickly.
So it's a team effort, both branches working together.
Exactly. A beautifully orchestrated response.
Now, you mentioned negative feedback also operates at the presynaptic level. What does that mean?
It means the release of neurotransmitters from those nerve terminals can be regulated by feedback mechanisms as well.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, remember those alpha-2 receptors we talked about?
The ones that act as autoreceptors on noradrenergic nerve terminals?
Exactly. They help regulate norepinephrine release.
Right.
So when norepinephrine is released, it can actually bind to those alpha-2 receptors on the presynaptic nerve terminal.
Okay.
And this binding inhibits further release of norepinephrine.
It's like a brake pedal.
Exactly. It prevents the signal from getting too strong.
Does this happen with other neurotransmitters too?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
For example, on cholinergic nerve terminals, you have muscarinic receptors that can inhibit acetylcholine release.
Okay.
So both branches use similar mechanisms to fine-tune neurotransmitter release.
It's amazing how everything is connected. So we've got regulation at the system level, at the synapse level. What about the receptors themselves? Can they be regulated?
You're asking all the right questions. Yes, we also have postsynaptic regulation, which involves modulating the receptor itself or its downstream signaling pathways.
So how does that work?
One way is through desensitization. If a receptor is exposed to its neurotransmitter for a prolonged period, it can become less responsive.
Oh, so it's like getting used to a strong smell. You don't notice it as much after a while.
Exactly. It's a way to prevent overstimulation and maintain responsiveness to changes in neurotransmitter levels.
It's so intricate, all these layers of regulation.
It's what allows the autonomic nervous system to maintain such precise control over our bodily functions.
It's truly remarkable. We've talked about how the system operates now. I'm curious about how we can manipulate it with drugs. It seems like there's a lot of potential there.
Absolutely. Autonomic pharmacology is a huge field, and our source gives us a table showing how drugs can interfere with autonomic transmission.
Okay, so what are some of the ways?
Well, some drugs target action potential propagation, the electrical signal that travels along nerves,
Okay.
like local anesthetics, lidocaine, for example.
Ah, so they block nerve conduction altogether.
Exactly. They block sodium channels, which are essential for generating those electrical signals.
So they numb the area by preventing pain signals from getting through?
Precisely. Other drugs target the synthesis, storage, or release of neurotransmitters, like we discussed earlier.
Right, metaracine, reserpine, those kinds of drugs.
Exactly. And then there are drugs that act directly on the receptors themselves.
The agonists and antagonists.
Exactly like albuterol, which is a beta-2 agonist used in inhalers for asthma.
Right, it mimics the effects of norepinephrine opening up the airways.
And then you have beta blockers like propranolol, which are antagonists. They block the effects of norepinephrine at beta receptors.
So they can slow down heart rate and lower blood pressure.
Exactly. It's amazing how we can use this knowledge to develop drugs that target very specific aspects of autonomic function.
It really is. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to that blepharospasm case you mentioned, that botulinum toxin is actually targeting the somatic motor nerves controlling the eyelids, not the autonomic nervous system directly.
It's a good point, and it highlights how interconnected these systems really are.
Right.
While botulinum toxin isn't typically considered an autonomic drug, it works by blocking acetylcholine release, which, as we know, is a key player in both systems.
So even though we categorize them separately, there's a lot of overlap.
Exactly. It emphasizes the holistic nature of our bodies and how all these systems are constantly communicating and influencing each other.
This deep dive has been so fascinating. We've explored the autonomic nervous system from its basic parts to its complex regulatory mechanisms and its relevance to pharmacology.
It's been my pleasure to share this journey with you, and remember, we've only just begun to understand this incredible system.
That's what makes it so exciting. There's still so much to discover, so much potential for future therapies.
Absolutely. And for all of you listening out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep being amazed by the wonders of your own body.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the autonomic nervous system.